our regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. We do not appear to have any members of the public who would wish to speak, so I can skip over that portion. So it looks like we're just going to go on to item B, which is a work session, continuation of clear and objective update. I did want to just kind of provide a little bit of some context for this evening's conversation. I think hopefully all of you received the email from our chair, Commissioner Taylor, who's unable to be here tonight. And I'll let Janessa kind of tag on to what I'm going to say, but basically we were really kind of in this pre-process, which despite the fact that we are actually looking at draft code, we are still relatively early in the process in that we will still have opportunities for public hearing, both at the Planning Commission and at Council. And so I think the expectation really is to provide some good overview direction for staff so that they have a general direction of where to go with some of the code changes and specifics, but not necessarily to get into the super granular details. So some of the things maybe that came up last week, for example, like where did this arbitrary number come from? And that's really kind of helpful for staff to be able to come back and explain, and then we can kind of move on from there. But but as far as just super very specific things, I think we want to try to kind of pull back from getting way into the weeds, if that makes sense. Janessa, do you want to add anything to that?
I think that's great. I would add that, this is such an incremental process, and it's unusual to have code language or to have proposed code language prior to City Council even initiating the actual code amendment process. And so I think that can give people the sense of urgency that things are much more baked in than they are. And that's not the case. There's still plenty of time for revisions, and especially fine-tuning details and things like dimensions and things that we're picking and whether they make sense. I really want to hear all that information for sure, and invite any of those kind of comments and feedback to continue to come in at any point. There's not really a deadline for that, especially at least until we get to the public hearing processes and once the actual code amendments are initiated. But right now, keep it coming, for yourselves as well as the public or people who are staying kind of plugged into the process. I really appreciate that level of detail and comments and stuff. It helps make the code better. But for here and for the purpose of our check-ins right now, we went through the process of identifying key issues and then figuring out which of those key issues are within the scope of this project, and we did that. And so then we went on to the working group sessions in order to go over those key issues and come up with some ideas on how to do those. And we did that process. And then we came back to you with the recommendations based on, evaluating all the different options and came up with the recommendations that then were blessed by yourselves, and in one case at least changed a bit. And then we took those recommendations to council. Council blessed those to move forward into code writing process. So that's kind of where we are today. Is we're at the point where we've done our first attempt at drafting some code language to implement those recommendations. So the check-in that we really need from you right now is not necessarily word for word that this is perfect. We want this adopted as it exactly is now. We want to know, are we within the bumpers that we set for this project? Are we generally hitting the mark on creating a framework that achieves the recommendations that we all agreed on? Or that yourselves and council agreed to pursue. So that's kind of where we want to bring it up a little higher level for these discussions and look more at, with each code section that we're going to go over, is it generally hitting the mark? Is there anything, such as last week came up, Commissioner Borofsky, for you, there was one particular section or subsection of a section that was the only section that you really have a major issue with. What I'd like to do is still vote on the whole, straw poll vote on the whole section, and then I'll capture that and keep track of that and pass that feedback along. So if you feel compelled to vote no on the whole thing and want to make the clarification that really it's just the subsection such and such and such that I disagree with, I'll make that note and pass that on so that it has the context that I think you were, if I'm understanding you from last week, you were looking for. So that's kind of where we'd like to be tonight, is to go a little bit more holistically through the sections, know if there's any major objections, and certainly if there's questions and things that I can look up and come back to you with or get more information to you, I want to know those things too. Anything?
Okay. I think Commissioner Baker's moving.
Well, I'm not really a co-chair, so.
Okay, so and then the other thing I would like to mention that maybe you want to talk about the order. We're going to kind of continue on. We're not going to go through the tree standards tonight, but we have plenty of material to cover. And then we are going to kind of go back and revisit a few things from our previous meeting so that we can kind of reassess based on the new context of how we're going to be looking at things. So is that?
Yeah, tonight I'm hoping that we can get through everything except for the tree preservation standards. Those will hold for next week. We had committed to some people who are still trying to respond to those, and we're overwhelmed with the time pressure. So I want to respect that we expected it would be next week. But outside of that, I think we could get through the other sections. And yes, I do want to revisit the transition standards to get that higher level straw poll that I don't think we captured last week. But I'm proposing to kind of move on, starting with where we left off, and then I'll bring us back to the transition standards where there's an opportunity that makes sense to put it in there.
Okay. And so then just a quick question then. So for the benefit of the listening audience, there is still some time if they want to weigh in and have some feedback specific to that the commission will be reviewing that at next week's meeting. So
absolutely.
Definitely
Yes.
want to, okay.
And I'm forwarding, I think since our last meeting, there were only 2 additional pieces of feedback that came in, and you were all forwarded that information.
Perfect. Okay.
And also for the viewing or listening audience, next week's meeting is Tuesday, April 30th, 5:30 here in the Slit Room.
All right. Commissioner Baker?
The only thing I was wondering is, should we revisit the issue that Commissioner Borofsky raised to see if there's a difference in the straw poll now than it was then, or?
I think the plan was to go back to that once we kind of cover a few items, but we will go back to that section. Okay, let's get going.
Ready to go?
And we're ready.
So we're going to start batch 2. We're going to start with the street standards modification. So if you turn to page 4 in your packet, towards the bottom of page 4, it starts with block length. So first, before we go on to this, I wanted to revisit a little bit the key issues as well as the recommendations, just so that we all have a little bit more context of where the changes came from. So the key issue for these amendments was from the fact that projects in already very stated maximums for block length, street connectivity, and cul-de-sac emergency vehicle turnarounds, where physical conditions such as topography or natural resources or existing physical developments precludes compliance with the standard. So one of the things that had come up in the original code audit and when we were generating the key issues list was that we should consider additional standards to bolster that preclude language and/or consider requiring the modifications to be reviewed under an adjustment review process. So that's really where the recommendation came from, was that issue that was identifying the preclude language and suggesting that we have really clear exceptions for clear and objective track applications, and then allow the discretionary adjustment review option for when those exceptions aren't, when discretion's just necessary in order to allow them. So there's 3 sections that pertain to the street modification or street standards modifications. There's a section on block length, there's a section on connectivity for streets, and then a section on cul-de-sacs and emergency vehicle turnarounds. So the amendments that are in front are included in the packets, basically looked at the existing exceptions that were allowed and tried to filter them down to what we felt could be a clear and objective exception. If the things that were kind of lost in that filtering process, so to speak, those would still be available through the adjustment review process. And that's the kind of 4th component there. We have a section that we'll get to after these first 3 sections that is adding approval criteria language to our adjustment review section so that it's clear we have that adjustment review option for any of these 3 standards. And so that's the crux of these changes. I know some of the feedback was on the term preclude, and I just wanted to point out that that is existing language, and these amendments actually move the clear and objective away from using that language.
Commissioner Fragola.
Could you just remind me, is the adjustment review, is that part of the clear and objective process, or does that take an applicant out of the clear and objective process?
It can be processed along with the clear and objective land use application. So ideally, things that need to be adjusted are identified up front and included in the review. And it's a type 2 planning director decision application for the adjustment review. So it would be processed along with, say, the site review or subdivision or whatever land use application is.
So it doesn't take them outside of the clear and objective process?
It's a separate discretionary process that they would opt into. But they don't lose they don't lose the ability to follow the clear and objective path for the remaining criteria.
That's what I was wondering. Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Adjustments only for those particular characteristics of those adjustments.
There's if it helps, there's several sections of the code that say an approved adjustment I'm not remembering it verbatim, but it effectively says that an approved adjustment constitutes compliance with a standard.
Okay.
Okay. So then, are we looking for straw poll on this first section of block length?
I had one clarifying question.
Okay,
I wasn't sure if Janessa was going to go through these or if we're just going to jump right in, which is fine. I just wanted to, go ahead.
No.
Oh, I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding it right. So on the particular one related to block length, the clear and objective option, the only way you can, that you don't comply with the 600 feet is if there are slope constraints. If there aren't slope constraints, then that kicks you into the adjustment review. So that really the only option to not comply with that is slope, and then you'd go adjustment review. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Just want to make sure I was understanding it right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? Commissioner Baker?
Just to clarify too, the reason this was there was the fire marshal, well, theoretically, we have a preclusion about streets 800 feet or longer from the fire marshal in terms of if they're dead ends,
Right.
access. So this was trying to, I think, incorporate some of that information in the clear and objective standards. So we didn't say 800, we said 600, so it could be modified slightly.
And the 600 was existing. That's whether you're discretionary or clear and objective, that's the standard.
All right, are we ready for a straw poll on,
Just so, let me
Commissioner
be
Ramey?
clear, I just want to repeat what we're voting, what I think.
okay,
So our motion is to forward this to City Council for initiating the next phase of code adoption, code
Adoption.
amendment. And we find that this general approach is acceptable and meets the identified issues. And we're not doing word-by-word approval, but we're saying generally these are the right sections of the code to approve. And we realize there's chance in the future to manipulate or get into the details, but we're not doing that today.
Fine tune.
So I want to be sure that they understand that we didn't look at every comma and every semicolon and say, yes,
all right.
carve it in stone. We're saying this is generally the right approach, and we recommend that you forward this to the next step.
Absolutely. That's a great clarification. Yeah. I will be very clear with council that the exact language is not necessarily locked in, that everybody is recognizing that this is still a draft and will likely have some changes through the public process that we go through.
I think that helps me know kind of what, so if we see something giant, then we can vote it down, and you'll note what our giant issue is. Otherwise, we're going to.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And
Thank you, that's helpful.
And the straw poll that we would do now is just for section 9.6810, and then we'll do each section separately.
Commissioner Borowski, you had a question?
Yeah, and I think that I agree with Commissioner Ramey on that, because I think that hopefully, I mean, I've seen some of the comments that have come in, and people who work with the code a lot more than we do might be able to give input that we're changing this thing harks back to different parts of the code that intertwine that we may not see or know. I mean, Alyssa knows every page of the code, but the rest of us aren't as lucky as that. So that's kind of what I'm hoping to get more of. I mean, I saw some of that in the input that we got. It's kind of like, well, if you do this, what about this? And that's what I'm looking for in the next phase, being able to address that. And also getting to the overall, kind of like one of the commenters, the overall goal of this, is what is the overall goal of this? Is it to, make things so that clear and objective works for the general public? And that's to me is the main goal, not making it worse.
Okay, we ready? So we're looking for general straw poll on 9.6810. All in favor, I suppose? All right. Looks like that's unanimous.
And there was the one clarification from Commissioner Randall. Any other objections, questions, or clarifications necessary on that section at this point?
Nope, great, okay.
So then the next section is 9.6815. That starts on page 5, the next page of your packet. And that's for the street connectivity standards. So similar to the other, this is just restructuring so that it makes it clear that the existing exceptions are available to the discretionary track, and the word, the language that's used there remains. And then for clear and objective, the specific exemptions are provided. And the adjustment review option is there if they want to seek a further exception.
Commissioner Fragala.
So the specific exceptions are in G, 1 and 2,
H.
H. Okay.
For subsection H on page 6, I believe, allows 4 different exceptions.
So just those 4. And so then they would again be kicked into the adjustment review. Because if I remember correctly, this whole section was to clearly identify exceptions and allow for adjustment review, right?
Correct.
So we
That
have
was
them
the
clearly
recommendation.
identified now and have the adjustment review in place. Great.
Correct.
Right. Commissioner Borowski.
So this is just a question. I know that in one of our past LUBA decisions, the 19-lot rule got thrown out. Is this where that would get captured and fixed? I mean, I know that when it got thrown out, there was sentiment that we felt it was not a bad rule, it just was written badly. Is that going to be captured anywhere in this? And if so, is this the section that it's in? And if so, where?
This is, the 19-lot rule was discussed, and let me, if you,
Is that part of batch one?
that was part of batch
Oh.
one. And this is part of it. Some of the feedback that we got from Public Works staff on, if we were to eliminate the 19-lot rule, whether that would be problematic. And some of the feedback that we got was that the street connectivity standards were pretty significant, and they didn't feel we were necessarily losing the ability to have street connectivity by losing the 19-lot rule. And then we also, sorry, I feel like I'm looking at it.
So while
We don't call it
you are
19
looking
lot.
at that, I'll brief the commissioners who weren't on the board. So there was a planned unit development in the south part of town, and there was a section that said if you have more than 19 lots on one access point, you have to put another access point in. And it wasn't feasible to do it because of hills and stuff like that. And there was actually a way, it came out and you could turn left or you could turn right, but right was only a dead end. And in the LUBA decision, it decided that you could go both ways. And so it wasn't clear and objective, kind of. And so it got thrown back to us, and we had to take that rule out of our code, or not enforce that rule.
So that particular approval criterion still exists in the code. It will be removed as part of this clear and objective update. And then part of the working group discussion was, could we kind of get to those same planning goals through a different method? And one of the main pieces of that was I think, the ensuring adequate street connectivity. And we have some pretty robust street connectivity standards already, but what the proposed language is hoping to do is to really differentiate between those that are applicable to the discretionary track folks and those that would now be applicable to the clear and objective track folks, and try to ensure that the clear and objective track folks are really getting clear and objective standards.
Commissioner Baker, did you have a comment or question?
Well, I'll just say this is, and Commissioner Randall pointed out, because I was digging it out of my old notes, this is related to this, the adjustment review is described on 9.8 on page 13, starts on the bottom of page 13. So I assume that we'll discuss that. But they're sort of interrelated. So just so you know, you might want to put a note, that go to page 13 when it talks about this character.
Okay.
And that's kind of getting to my point. I mean, there have been issues that have been raised over the years at LUBA decisions. Not very many have gone against us, but the hope was that the ones that have gone against us, we can either fix by writing better language and use this tool to fix what the intent of the code was when it was written, but it just wasn't written correctly.
As clearly and objectively
Yes.
as it could have been. Yes.
And I was just wondering where 19 lot fits into that. And partially in here, it sounds like, and maybe partially someplace else.
And partially in batch one, correct.
Okay.
Commissioner Baker?
And just a clarification, just for the new commissioners that weren't maybe part of that discussion. The 19-lot rule, if you had more than 19 lots on a cul-de-sac, then the particular sites needed to be sprinkled. In other words, it would allow you to have more than 19 lots, but there was a requirement, as I recall, that the houses needed to be, some fire, I can't remember exactly.
It was secondary access was
Secondary
required.
access or the properties.
No.
Our requirement was, I think you're thinking the fire code
Fire
that we think that it
Okay,
might be trying to address.
right, yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, that's right, because we discussed them both. So ours was just a lot line. The fire code allowed you to have more than a certain number of lots, but then the properties needed to be sprinkled, or that's not quite, right,
Building code.
Building.
Planning, yeah.
yeah.
All right. Any other questions, comments on this section? All right, let's get a straw poll on 9.6815. All in favor? All right, that one's unanimous.
Okay. And so the next section, 9.6820, is kind of more of the same, restructuring it to make it clear that the clear and objective exception, and I believe there's only one exception for the cul-de-sacs that can be granted, and then the adjustment review option if that exception can't be met.
All right, oh, sorry, Commissioner Randall,
Okay.
reading.
On the, on subsection, on 5C, it says that the exception may be granted if the applicant provides certification stating that a cul-de-sac cannot be constructed to meet the current standards, but it doesn't mention a fire turnaround. And I'm wondering, should fire turnaround be in there as well? Because that would accomplish the same thing.
Oh, the emergency vehicle turnaround.
The emergency vehicle turnaround, because up in the upper section in 1, I think, or 2, somewhere, in one of the others, you talk about having a cul-de-sac bulb, yeah, it's in 1, designed as a cul-de-sac bulb or an emergency vehicle turnaround, which is kind of the alternate to having a cul-de-sac. And yet for the exception, it just says cul-de-sac and doesn't say fire emergency vehicle turnaround.
So we could
Yeah,
add that.
I guess I would suggest that that be added,
Great.
All right,
since this one isn't adjustable.
Well,
Is it not adjustable?
I
Or is the
think-
adjustment language is not
I think
included?
I think we need to add the adjustment language
Okay.
here. So it was intended to be
Okay,
adjustable.
that would be good, but I noticed it didn't say that on there, so I would suggest those two things.
So, great.
I still think the emergency vehicle turnaround should be as part of the exceptions rather than an adjustment review.
Agreed. I think that would be an easy insertion if everyone is okay.
okay. Oh, yes, Commissioner Baker.
Just a question, do we have emergency vehicle, do we have a definition for the emergency vehicle turnaround? I mean, in other words, it might be,
Fire code has that as far as the dimensions.
but do we,
That are required.
we should maybe state the definition is defined in the fire code then or something. So that it's not, it's clear what it means. If we don't have a definition for it. I think cul-de-sac has a general definition. That particular term is,
We
Yeah,
can
I don't know
follow
that
up
it's ever been a
and,
problem.
yeah, we can follow up and see if that comes out of the fire code or the building code or from the public improvement standards. We can figure out where that's from.
Okay,
And if we need to make some kind of citation, we can do that for clarity.
I think you'll find that one in the fire code.
Yeah.
But I'm remembering.
Commissioner Borowski.
So I'm just harking back to Oakley Meadows, and I'm looking at subsection 4, and it says, "Public access ways to provide safe circulations for pedestrians, bicycle, and emergency vehicles shall be required." How is that sentence clear and objective? Safety, to me, is different to different people. And that was brought up as a major point in an appeal that we saw 3 different times.
So you're saying that?
I don't know, I
the
mean,
concept of
it didn't get
safe is
changed. That's
subjective.
the language that was in there before.
Yep.
And that was the language that we struggled with, and that was the language that the neighbors harped on that this wasn't a safe, so,
Safe circulation.
I mean, we came down that it was clear, but it was a tough decision.
So Commissioner Borowski, I take your point.
Yeah.
I think that the approval criterion that you were thinking about is actually in the 9.8 thousands as part of the PUD approval criteria.
Okay.
Oakley, if you'll remember, was actually a discretionary.
Yeah, but just
But-
going to that, I mean, how do you say that an access way is safe, clear, and objectively?
I think that's a good point, and that is something that maybe.
Yeah, I mean, you're asking
better
for
look
things to
at.
flag.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because to me, what may feel safe to me may not feel safe to somebody at the end of a cul-de-sac.
We can certainly take a second look.
Okay, Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, another way to, just a suggestion, but in one of the issues, there is another way to modify that is to say no more than 150 in length and no narrower than required by the fire code or something like that. In other words,
In what section, or what?
section 4.
Or?
In other words, we specify the length. You can clarify it by specifying the minimum width rather than saying a specific number, we can refer to fire code, if that's.
And number 4, just to be clear, is talking about like a pedestrian path that goes from the end of a cul-de-sac to somewhere else to
What says emergency vehicles, to provide.
turn around, right? So
Pedestrians,
kind of
bicycles.
basically at your dead end, you need to provide a public access way. So it's not a street, it's like a pedestrian or bicycle access.
No, it has emergency vehicles.
Okay, oh,
Emergency
there it
vehicles.
is. Yep.
So this is the thing about if it's longer than 150 feet, then
Well, and if I could, we're kind of veering into standards that we didn't address. We did
Right.
not analyze these standards. These are the standards,
already there.
the thing that we looked at was the key issue of providing the exceptions, that the exceptions be clear and objective. So it's kind of like the preclude word earlier. This is existing code language that we really didn't go in through and comb through it. I'm sure there's other opportunities to
Right.
provide clarity or word craft and change existing code, but I'm a little worried about scope creep right now.
Okay. All right, any other comments on this section? Okay, I think we've kind of have the notes to follow up on those items. Okay, so,
Would you like me to reiterate what I
Yes,
captured?
that would be
Then
great.
What I have is to add the emergency vehicle turnaround language to subsection C, to add the adjustment review option text that inadvertently got left out, to look into is the definition of emergency vehicle turnaround necessary, or where does that come from? And then how safe is clear and objective, or whether that's something we need to pursue.
okay. All right, so straw poll on, let me go back to read what
just clarifications.
okay.
So
Commissioner
the last one you mentioned is what the definition of, or the clarification of safe circulation. Yeah.
Safe circulation, okay.
Safe circulation. So, straw poll on 9.6820. Anybody? Right? Okay, unanimous.
Okay, so we're going to leap over the next few pages of
We're
trees.
leaping over the tree.
We're leaping over the trees. Watch your feet. And going to page 13. And so we're going to, yes, at the bottom, and we're going to talk about the adjustment review criterion that we added. So this just, again, creates that pathway for an optional discretionary adjustment review to get an exception to any of those 3 street standards that we just talked about, and gives the approval criterion that that would have to be met in order to grant the adjustment review.
And Commissioner Fragala, to your previous question, if an applicant chose to go through the adjustment review, once they have made that choice, they're, for that approval criterion, they're out of clear and objective and into discretionary, and so these standards are not required to be clear and objective.
Correct.
But only on the one they're getting the adjustment review.
Only on the one they're getting the
The
adjustment.
rest of the application would still be able to be clear and objective.
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
And, yeah, and this language that is the approval criterion, or criteria, does not need to be clear and objective.
Questions? Commissioner Broff?
And just to be clear, so an adjustment review, you said, is type 2. And what is the appeal process on a type 2 land use application?
A type 2 is appealable to the hearings official.
To the hearings official.
This is an initial planning director decision.
Right, planning director decides it, hearing official can affirm, deny, or to overturn, and then that's the end of the appeal on a type 2?
Yes, for the city process.
Right.
Unless the applicant has consolidated multiple applications and one of them is a higher application type. So if they have a type 2 and a type 3 and they want those applications decided consolidated, then everything moves up to the higher application type, and a type 3 would be an initial hearings officer decision with an appeal to planning commission.
So type 2 stops at hearings official?
Yeah.
Doesn't go to LUBA or Court of Appeals?
Oh, no, it does go to LUBA. Yeah, yep. The hearings official is the final city decision, and then it can be appealed up to LUBA. Yep.
That's what I was wondering. So there is an avenue for appeals, it just goes out of the city's realm at that point.
That's right.
Commissioner Baker?
Yeah, I had a concern about, under A, it says, it is not technically or financially feasible. That seems to be, I don't know how well defined that might be and what we mean by that. I mean, technically, I could understand, but financially, what does that mean?
That's a good point, and some of the feedback that we got also kind of addressed that and kind of suggested that rather than the language of financially feasible, that maybe does not result in excessive costs. It's based on the idea that you can engineer anything. So you know, being technically feasible may be a difficult bar, or technically infeasible may be a difficult bar, but that doesn't mean that the costs could be incredibly high in order to do that. And that was something that we wanted to, under a discretionary process, allow for that type of an exception and for that to be a consideration.
Right. Does that make sense?
And just to also point out, the financially feasible aspect on, I think, adjustment reviews occurs in other areas of adjustment reviews for different, not anything we're looking at here, but it is in the code in other places. If something isn't financially feasible, you can get an adjustment for that.
Okay.
So it's not setting a precedent, I guess.
I mean, continuing on that, it might make sense to have a definition or some clarification somewhere of what we mean by that, so it's not completely to the appellate, the applicant to
Well, the
determine.
burden's on the applicant to show that. So
But just to give some guidelines, so we don't have such indefined criteria in a PUD application or in a discretionary application. You could probably have more flexible language, but if we want it to be clear and objective, so we don't end up having
This-
appeals.
this doesn't,
This-
this part
this-
doesn't have.
This piece is discretionary.
This piece.
Oh, this is discretionary.
This would be a discretionary decision on whether or not that adjustment was allowed.
That's why you get the adjustment.
So if this was appealed, it would go a different path.
Same path, but it is, the fact that discretion is involved in reviewing and approving or denying the adjustment request, that is okay. It's not, it doesn't need to be clear and objective.
Commissioner Borowski.
And I think that it was brought up in some of the things that maybe just looking at that sentence, and there may be a better way to state that sentence, but that the idea is there, just figuring out the best way to put it in so it's not as ambiguous, I think is what was being hoped for in the comments that I saw. So that's direction, that's not wordsmithing. And
Okay.
it's just one, from one commissioner.
So the clarification or the feedback that I've got captured is regarding the term financially feasible. Is there a way to reduce the ambiguity in that?
So question, Janessa, as far as the follow-up on this particular feedback, how would that be something that we would then go over next week? Or is that something you just plan on just kind of sending out, and is that how you want to handle that?
I think in part it depends on the result of the straw poll, because if, for instance, 5 commissioners are fine with it and not, and if Commissioner Baker does not want to, vote yes on this one because of that language, and I can capture that that's why, then, I'll proceed follow-up, give you that information, but it wouldn't be a formal, you need to review it and bless that language. Again, I would just make sure to capture that and then also pass that on at council and explain whether we make any changes between now and then to address it.
Okay. All right. Are we ready for straw poll on 9.8030? All in favor? Commissioner Baker? You good? Okay. 6-0?
Okay, so now we're going to jump back to the transition standards and also and take a straw poll for that entire section. I don't think we, unless somebody needs to discuss that more. We did extensive discussion last week, but we didn't go back and capture the straw poll for the entire section. Oh, sorry. That starts, the transition standards themselves start on page 1. And then we're also going to talk about 3 specific code sections that are one sentence, and they just say the proposal complies with EC 9.5860 transition standards. And these are the places where plan unit development, site review, and conditional use permit will point back to the transition standards. So there's 4 straw polls involved in this, 1 for the transition standards section, and then 3 for each of the sections, the 1-sentence additions.
And then that, okay, I see it.
So to start
Starting
with,
at
I think we should start with the transition
transitions.
standards before we,
And that's the 9.5860?
correct, 9.5860.
Okay. We had a lot of discussion at our last meeting on this. I know, Commissioner Baker, you were gone.
And
You watched,
I can kind of recap where the takeaways that I captured last week. One of the things was to compare the allowed intrusions with those under the existing allowable intrusions under EC 9.6745 to determine whether the existing allowances can be used instead. I have done that analysis, and it's somewhat of a wash. There are some things that are included within the transition standards section that on allowed intrusions that are not included in the other one. So it would not be a simple point to an existing chunk of code and not need to also add additional allowances here. The other thing that I would say in my opinion is that in going to the allowed intrusion section, there are several that only apply to front yard setbacks. And so one of the things that, one of the takeaways that I had in looking at it is that if we're pointing to that section, you're going to have to kind of pick and choose the ones that really apply versus having it very clear embedded within the transition standards themselves. So I'm happy to give more information and I can send out maybe something that has the highlighted areas that don't apply within the other standard. I don't know how much into detail commissioners want to get, but overall, I feel like the ones that we included, they were meant to apply more specifically to these types of setbacks.
And for clarity, they only apply within that setback we're talking about. They don't apply to the rest of the building, so it's only that one that's adjacent to the R1 or whatever.
Right, only where that transition standard applies, which could be a very small amount of property line.
And when we were looking at these last week, what I was seeing is that these specific ones deal primarily with the privacy concerns. And that's the issue with transitions, well, at least this part. And by just referring to the other transition or the other intrusion section, there are a lot of things in there that I think we don't want to allow in this. And so I think this is a real good way to do that in referencing, in lieu of these intrusions, these are the ones you can do. And so I think this captures that really well from my perspective.
Okay. Commissioner Borowski?
I'm a little bit uneasy because of the expertise that we've gotten in the past few days, and the comments that were received after our last meeting, after we went through this, was fairly substantial on the transition standards. And it was not just setbacks and, that if you've got a 6-foot fence, you can't have a 6-foot fence in the front yard, those little technical things. It was more policy type things. Are we protecting R1 at the detriment of density? And so those weren't conversations that had been raised to me before that meeting, that when we went through these. And so it gives me pause here to say that what I signed off on the other day with, I'm okay with, because I've read through some of the comments, and a lot of the comments make sense to me, and not. So I'm not sure I'm ready to give a thumbs up on this, and it wasn't just a one little section. It's more of a broad-based, making me think, are we prioritizing R1 with these setbacks and these transition zones, which we've heard from neighbors is important, and I've been hearing it since I've been on this commission. And so that was kind of in the back of my head when I was saying, yes, these transition zones make sense. But after reading some of the comments and listening to people in the community that are looking at it through a different lens than an R1 neighbor, looking at it as, how can we grow in this community? It gives me pause, and I'm not sure how to address that going forward with these recommendations, having had that input. Whether there's going to be time to do that once the code is being written, I think that what will happen is when you present this to council, there is going to be a fair amount of direct input to council, and that gives me pause as well, because I think that we are the people that can look at it and make it work better than council to a certain extent, because we deal with it more often. I mean, that's kind of our thing, is dig deep, take 3 hours to look, or 5 hours to look at these things and make recommendations. So I don't know where to go on this.
Can I respond a
Yes,
little
please.
bit to some
Yeah.
of that? Because it is, you know, we've talked a little bit about how these are a specific subset of regulations that apply only in certain situations. So these aren't going to apply to quite a few developments that are going to occur by right, that, you know, you have significant amounts of R3 and R4 that don't have a site review overlay, that could develop under the multifamily standards and the normal setbacks, and then the requirements that we already have when they're of an additional setback and height limitation adjacent to R1. So there's, in part, I just want to kind of revisit the fact that these are not going to apply frequently. It's not just about multifamily next to an R1 property that's a single-family dwelling. It's also an assisted care facility or a campus living organization or some other uses that might have characteristics that are different than just, you know, having a couple apartments next to a single-family dwelling. This was something that through the working groups, through the key issues, seeking those, it definitely brought up the issue of compatibility and a feeling, you know, there was concern that compatibility was not adequately addressed. The working groups took that and really kind of honed in on, right, but we don't want to have unintended consequences, so we really want to look at having them where they make sense. So that was where we came up with the higher intensity uses next to lower intensity uses. Some of the feedback comments have kind of assumed that these, you know, like the height restriction or limitation would apply throughout the site. You may have a, you know, 5-acre site that has a, you know, 100-foot shared property line with a R1 property. It's only going to apply between the building and that property line that's shared with the R1 property, you know, the abutting property. So they're not, I mean, I feel like they were crafted to be more surgical in applying and creating some transition areas when they're triggered. They're not necessarily going to be ubiquitous around, you know, in applying, but they do try to get at the concerns and the general direction that there was fair agreement with through the working groups. So again, this level is more, we have the recommendation. The recommendation was to look at transition standards, have some things that address setbacks, give some options, you know, setbacks, height limitations, landscape screening, and that would do so only, you know, that wouldn't buffer an R1 neighborhood from another R1 neighborhood. And I think we've achieved that with these proposals. There could still be some definite, you know, refinement in the language, and some of the feedback that we've gotten are, like, for instance, you use the fence along the interior property line that then goes into the front yard setback where that's an easy fix. So that, you know, just taking it up a level to address the philosophical question about whether or not transition standards are even necessary between a residential use and another residential use. That's a much bigger question and not what our recommendation was charging us with.
Robin, you comment?
Yeah, just to kind of follow up really briefly on that, it seems like the gist of the exercise is to find out where that fine line is between too much protection and too little protection, right? I mean, this is the crux of our discussions all the time. It seems to me like for this exercise, what we're doing right now, you asked, you know, what do I do with this feeling that you have and the feedback that you've heard? It seems to me like what would be most helpful is if there are some aspects of what is being proposed that you feel go too far, perhaps in that sense, to know what those are. And either some alternative for how to address that, or just to say, you know, I don't think this is something that's important for us to address. Anything along those lines would really be helpful. If you're just generally uncomfortable with it, so that's one way to address it. Another one is if you're just generally uncomfortable with it, then through the straw poll process, you can make a note of that, and we will carry that information forward to council. So that's two different ways you could approach it.
I have Commissioner Baker, then Commissioner Fragla, Commissioner Ramey, then I'm going to put myself in the queue after that.
I just wanted to point out that transitions have been on our sort of list of things to do for like, I don't know, how many, 8 years? I mean, we know it was a high priority and we wanted to deal with it. And this, this is a good attempt at trying to deal with that in the cases where it applies, which includes, single occupancy units and some other things as well as because this applies. And the other thing that I liked about this is that you have 4 different options. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you can, I think from an architectural standpoint, you really have a lot of flexibility in how you achieve these transitions. And although I read the comments, some of them didn't make sense to me. I mean, you could create a hypothetical case. A front yard backing up against another R1 site that doesn't make sense. If it's on an alley, you're probably going to have your parking access there, and it probably won't be the front yard of the building. So there were some cases thrown out there that just didn't seem like they would be very common at all. I mean, in fact, it seemed like they would be obscure. And you may never just have those occur in some long 50-year period. So we can't really try to cover every possible mutation of these things. It's just impossible from a code standard. We make an attempt, and if it turns out that there's some feature that is a problem, we can come back and revisit it, but we can't really have our first pass try to deal with every conceivable possible way that you might have a strange situation. So that's my point of view.
Okay. Commissioner Fragla?
Yeah, so when I was looking at this, I was looking at it, sometimes as somebody who doesn't have a tremendous amount of knowledge of this stuff, it really seemed very logical to me. It was like, if not this, if you don't check this, then try this. If you don't check this, then try this. And I think in some ways that's what we're looking for, right? And so when I'm reviewing it, I'm looking to see in this stage of the process, are we starting to get the structure in that way? And I feel like the approach that you are taking thus far is somewhat what we're aiming for, right? I do know from the work group that this issue of transitions was probably one of the most significant things that people expressed that they really wanted to see as part of the process. So I do want us to honor that. At the same time that I agree with Commissioner Borofsky that we need to balance the ability to, make sure we're not providing a significant barrier to developing housing. So I know last time we talked about adding pictures as examples. I hope, I'm sure you'll be providing that to council. You said this isn't going to have that high of an impact. I mean, I think somebody asked last time, like, what is the percentage of R1 and R2 or 3, or, where is this going to impact, right? And to just have an idea, maybe not for us, but, that might be something that'll be helpful to council and further on down the process. And I do also note that in here, there are exceptions for some of the missing middle housing, right? We have exceptions for a single triplex, a single fourplex, and I appreciated those exceptions for those missing middle pieces.
Commissioner Ramey?
So I have kind of three comments. I think without question, there's a need for transition, this kind of idea. Clear and objective is, but there's other things that other commissioners have already mentioned. So it's pretty clear we haven't created a solution to the problem that doesn't exist. This is a problem. Number two, generally agreeing with Commissioner Fregula, the approach we're taking seems like a good one. Sort of conceptually from a framework, there's multiple options. We're thinking about it in the right ways. The third thing I'm sure about is that this is really not what we should do in the end. There's a ton of details. This is where I end up with where Commissioner Borowski is. Well, there's a lot of details to work in. I have a whole, after reading these comments, I'm like, well, when do I get to start on this? Because I've got a whole bunch of ideas about how this could work. The difference between, you want specific examples where there is an alley. Why is it the same at a property line where it's a zero property line and the same at an alley? Maybe that makes sense to have a different standard in that condition. So I would support pushing these forward to council with the clear understanding that there's a lot of work to do, and I'm willing to do it, and I hope others are too. But I think there's a solution here, and this is the start of it, but it's probably not it, that gets us to that sort of visual protection when we're next to R1, but doesn't overly preclude the ability to build higher density housing, and hopefully makes it better than it is now. And then frankly, that should be our test. If we can't make it better than what we have now, then that should maybe be the first thing we look at is, well, have we really made it any better or we made it worse? So I'm going to support pushing this forward with the clear understanding that there's a lot more work to do, that really we're talking about describing a problem that exists, a framework for a solution, a more detailed framework, but knowing that there's still some more things to do. And if I can support that, knowing that we'll be able to participate in that solution as we go forward.
Well, I'll put myself in the queue because I just want to echo some of your comments because I actually agree with each of you, pieces of it. And I think that for me, I think that, obviously trying to figure out what is the problem we're trying to solve and what are the impacts, the long-term impacts, as well as understanding the magnitude of where it applies. And without knowing that and without knowing some specific examples, which I think is really hard. I struggle without, I love the diagrams because they kind of, it's like, okay, that's what we're looking at. That's what we're talking about. I think these are the kinds of circumstances that hopefully as we kind of continue to move through this process that we can shed some light on some of these things and maybe make those fine-tuned tweaks. It sounded at our last meeting we touched on when we talked about this, it was something that had been in the works for a while and it seemed like there was broad support, and I think that it does do a good job of trying to strike that balance between just where we need to make room for more housing, and then what also is the protections that those folks that are living in those single-family homes in R1 that are abutted against another zone that, may or may not care, but if they do, that we want to create an environment where we have friendly neighbors. And so I think that it is important to try to balance that. And I think we're on the right track. I mean, my general census here is that we're on the right track, but I definitely, with the caveat of, I think it does maybe need a little bit of work and some specific, maybe areas that it would apply or maybe wouldn't need to apply or whatnot. So that would be kind of my 2 cents. Commissioner Baker, you had another comment?
Yeah, just a suggestion. It might be helpful for us if you could produce a drawing. I mean, because like, for example, the issue with alleys, produce a drawing that shows R1 and R2 zones with alleys, because a lot of the city is, those areas with alleys are like R3 and R4, and this doesn't apply. So we would at least get some idea about when it would make sense to focus on, how much of a problem will it be? In other words, if there are a limited amount of areas or a significant amount, then we would focus more energy on it. But to see the area that has alleys and the area that is zoned R1 and R2, where this would apply, could be very different.
Well, and I think I would echo that to see where it has been a problem, because obviously these adjacent zones have been in existence. So if there have been attempts at development that didn't work out because of these types of issues, I think that would be helpful to kind of understand. I mean, I know that's a whole separate rabbit hole, but I think that's where I'm looking to the public to try to help us understand where would this apply? Where has it been a problem? Where what didn't happen or did happen, and somebody's really unhappy about what they are looking at next to them, I think that would be helpful. So I would just put that out there to the public that, I'd certainly like to hear where this applies. No, Commissioner Borowski, you had another comment.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate the commission weighing in on this, because after receiving, like I said, after receiving those comments, I think that this discussion was helpful for me, getting the conveyance across, and kind of like Commissioner Ramey brought up, I'm kind of in the same camp as him, and I really appreciate us being able to convey that with the new information that we got, and letting staff take that and run with it. As Commissioner Baker said, transitions has been something that has been on our list on the board that we haven't had up in 8 years, but it's been here for a long time. And so it is very important to me, and I think that I just see it in a little bit different light as of now. And afterwards, I can give you a good example where this happened in our neighborhood, where they put a big building right next to some beautiful townhouses that have a 5-foot setback. So.
Okay. So are we at a point of, you have another?
Yeah, I just want to
Mr.
say,
Baker?
for those of you that are the newer commissioners, the poster child for this was South University neighborhood, where we have R4, in some cases, directly abutting R1. So a site that can build a 120-foot building can be next to a 25-foot tall or 30-foot tall house with no transition.
Actually, just to clarify, there is actually, in the code already, there is within, I think is it within 50 feet of the two zone boundaries, that the building on the R4 would have to meet the same height as what's in the R1. So it could not be, no, that's been in there since this code was adopted in 2001.
Okay, but I thought that was part of the code,
There were some new standards that were adopted,
in place in 2000.
like
2002.
10 or 9 or 13,
Yeah.
that do apply specifically actually along the edge in South University along the R3 and R4 that has a wider setback. It's a 10-foot setback, and then there's the sloped setback.
I would also just mention that I think for me, knowing what the future zoning might look like, because that also would have an impact if you're looking along the transit corridors and whatnot as to what might potentially be upzoned at a certain point in time. I think that would also be relevant, I think, to how this would apply long-term, just as a thought. So anyhow, are we ready to take a straw poll on this? All right, so general consensus, we've had our discussion. I think staff knows generally kind of what we're looking to do moving forward. So where am I at? I'm sorry, I just turned the page. What's the?
9.5860.
9.5860. All those in favor, general direction. All right, 6-0.
Great.
With the lots of caveats, of
With
course.
lots of caveats, and the big one being, this one's going to change before it goes to formal adoption.
Yes.
Or through the formal adoption process. I also want to point out, looking at, trying to look at the zoning map and determine where these would apply or not is a bit of a challenge, and I'm not sure how to do it, or I would have brought those images to you. But I want to make a plug for the web map that we have available on the Clear and Objective project website, and I can send out the link to that again. But that's a great way to pull up the layer of zoning, pull up the overlay, so that you can see where site reviews or PUD overlays are, and then you can kind of just cruise the city and look for those places where R1 or R1.5, meets R3 or R4. What can't be captured with that, just to keep in mind, is that part of these would apply to, or these would also apply to conditional use permits. We have no way to know where those are going to be, because that could be an assisted living facility going in R1 next to, and so there's not really a way for me to quantify those for you. But the web map is a really, really good tool for looking at the ones that would be triggered just based on, likely multifamily next to a R1.
And the other one that's also difficult to map is that in R1, to do multifamily, it requires a planned unit development, and that would actually apply, so these standards would actually apply to the R1 property proposing the multifamily development. So they would also apply in that case. So we could, while we can map the transition where there's R1 next to other zones, also know that there are many places in the R1 where these, maybe not many, there are some places in the R1 where these would also apply.
Okay.
Could apply.
That is good to know. Thank you.
Okay, so the next 3 sections basically are just, let me get you a page to turn to. They're all identical, and they're replacing subsection 1. Turn to page 14 for the first one. So for conditional use permits, planned unit development, and site review for the clear and objective paths, subsection 1 previously was the subsection that required an applicant to demonstrate that they were needed housing. That has already been stricken or proposed to be stricken as part of batch 1. Part of batch 2, this one is to replace that subsection with the language that points to the transition standards that we just talked about. So I think we can move through straw polling these 3 sections
Do them together.
really quick, or do it together. I don't know that we need to do each one separate.
Okay, Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, under 9.8100, the last sentence, shouldn't that be approve conditions or deny?
So that was brought up in one of the feedbacks that you got. The first sentence talks about the hearings official shall approve, conditionally approve, or deny the conditional use permit application. That kind of establishes the 3 possibilities. The last section is really saying that the approval or the approval conditions need to be based on these approval criteria. So this is existing language, and this is a consistent construction found elsewhere in the code. So I don't feel like that needs to be changed.
Yeah, and I think, the words I look at are their approval criteria. So you're going to approve them based on approval criteria.
Right.
It just seems like we could have improved the language here, even if it's not reflected in other places, just so it's not so confusing.
I see what you're saying, but you wouldn't say you're going to deny something based on the approval criteria, right? So I think that's why,
Well,
They don't meet.
Well,
well, but not,
Why it's worded.
well,
I think it could be worded
you
either
wouldn't
way.
say, yeah.
But I think that the way that it's worded now means if you're going to approve or approve with conditions, it has to be because the application meets the following approval criteria.
And I'll point out that this is also the way it's worded in the discretionary criteria for the vast majority of these as well. So then we'd have an inconsistency.
Okay.
And we're trying to bring things closer together. I totally get your point, though.
Okay. Any discussion on the other, if we're going to straw poll all 3, I think that probably makes sense.
I had
Commissioner Baker?
yeah. I guess is all 3 meaning 9.832. Oh, no, page 14 and page, 25, yeah. Yeah, I have an issue with under 7.
Okay.
Under
On page 15?
Page 15. Is that included in the 3 we're voting on now?
No.
No,
3,
No, it's just,
we're just looking at subsection 1
or
of
subsection.
each of the, and that's the subsection that says that
Yeah,
Or conditional
Proposal
permit and
complies
AD.
with the
yeah,
transition.
it's a little confusing, just one.
So the straw poll's just on condition 1.
the straw poll is just on subsection 1 for these 3 code sections, which are for conditional use permits, plan unit developments and site review. And it basically calls to the transition standards that they requires compliance.
Just to be clear for those watching at home, in case you need any more clarity, we're talking about subsection 1 of the following code sections: 9.8100, 9.8325, and 9.8445.
We can break it out.
Clarification, we might note that 9.811 only has one section.
Included
your
in the
packet.
amendments.
In the
Correct. There's more sections in the code.
There's more in between. Okay.
There's only
We'll,
one
we'll
word.
be, we'll be addressing because this is the same language,
Right.
we can do each one separately if that's clearer.
I think we can do it all together. It is the same exact language in all 3 areas. But yes, there is content in between
And
that we will go back to.
Go over that.
So does that make sense? So for the purpose of, we are looking at 9.8100 subsection 1, 9.8325 subsection 1, and 9.8445 subsection 1, which are identical. So everybody up or down on this one? All right, 6-0.
Okay.
Great. And now we're going to go back. Am I right?
Actually, we're going to go page 15.
15. Well, that's kind of going back.
Well, it is back from the last one. You're right. And this is
All right.
Right. So this, let's see. So this is related to the transition standards. This issue was related to the 30-foot buffer requirement for PUDs. And as a key issue, it was brought up that the 30-foot wide landscape buffer was kind of a blunt tool, that it effectively, most of the time was protecting R1 property from other R1 property, as in the South Hills where plan unit developments often are implementing a subdivision or a future subdivision. So there were comments about it being unnecessary. And that it could actually isolate the plan unit developments, making them less integrated with the neighborhood. And the concerns about the amount of land that was necessary to provide the 30-foot buffer, and especially when considered on smaller lots, that disproportionately had a greater impact. So the recommendation that we came forward with out of the working groups, well, first off, the working groups definitely recognized that the concern was more about higher intensity developments next to lower intensity developments. So there was support to address that concern with the new transition standards that would specifically apply when that scenario is involved, where you've got higher intensity next to lower intensity, and to replace the 30-foot buffer requirement with those new standards. So that was the recommendation that we moved forward, and that was agreed on. And so this code amendment literally just takes out the 30-foot buffer criterion.
Commissioner Brofsky.
So I just have a question. So I'm going to just throw out a couple different scenarios and tell me how that fits in. So if we have a planned unit development that is all single family, it's just going to be the basic single family 10-foot setback or 5-foot setback. If it's a planned unit development of 10 single family lots that abuts R1. Okay, then if we've got a PUD that is a mix between single family and multifamily, if the multifamily is more than 30 feet away, so let's say the first lot is a single family, and then you're going into a higher density, mixed, a multifamily on part of the PUD. Are those transition standards going to be applied inside the PUD? No. It would just be to the other existing the other existing R1.
The perimeter of the development site.
So those transition standards wouldn't be in place if you put a single-family house, then next to it, it would just be the multifamily standards that would kick in to protect that single-family house. It wouldn't be the new transition standards.
Correct. And I think that if the single family that you're describing, if I'm understanding it right, it would be part of the development,
Yeah.
the overall
Yeah.
development. And so I think we would look to that, how they're designing and integrating that development together. So you wouldn't have, you wouldn't institute the transition buffer within the development between its own single-family development and multifamily development unless they propose to do something.
Right. So I guess that single-family house within the development then doesn't get the protections.
I think in a sense, it is the transition buffer
It is a
for the
But
development.
it's not to that single homeowner.
No, but I also
And
think
then
that, I mean,
yeah, I'm just asking.
they're not going to buy it without knowing that
they
that's the
don't own it yet.
scenario, that that's the situation.
Unless the land's vacant when they buy the house.
Due
And,
diligence.
no, and again, I was just asking scenarios. Thank you.
All right. Any other comments on subsection 3 of 9.8325? Commissioner Baker?
Well, the only thing that's interesting to me, Commissioner Brodsky's point is that, well, I guess so the transition standards wouldn't actually apply at the edge if it was a single family and an R1 across the property line, right? Because these only apply to triplex, fourplex structures.
If there's a, in this hypothetical development, Commissioner Borofsky explained, if you're talking a standard single-family lot at that perimeter of the development, a standard lot is going to be 50 feet wide and meet the setback. So it really already more than meets the transition standard requirement that
I'm
you
just
do
saying
that.
that it doesn't, I mean, at the edge, if you have a single family there's really not an issue for transitions. So it doesn't, our transition standards don't apply in that case, which means you don't have to deal with it.
Which was part of the goal, was to not require a 30-foot separation between a single-family home and a single-family home. Or 60 if it was two PUDs, right.
Right. Okay. So can I get a straw poll on all those in favor? All right, we've got 6-0. Okay, great.
So we get a couple slightly easier ones, I think. The next two are, again, kind of, I clumped them together because it's the same standard, effectively being eliminated from two different review tracks. So it's regarding the 20% grading prohibition. So this was one of the, this came up as a key issue, that this criterion may not be the most effective and efficient way to address potential impacts to steep slopes, and that it can have the effect of precluding development under the clear and objective track for sites when significant slopes exist, or for instance, one of the examples that I've talked about before is that you can have sites where, because there's areas of 20% slope, they can preclude your ability to access other areas that could be developed otherwise. So with the underlying idea that safely building on slopes is the concern, the recommendation that came out was to rely on the geotechnical standards and replace the standard with some additional language in the geotechnical standards. So we already discussed the geotechnical standards last week, and we did add a potential risk factor of slopes greater than 20% being addressed as part of the geotechnical certification. So that helps kind of identify that. And we also added additional items for the certification to address that gets at road layout and lot locations and whether further geotechnical analysis is recommended. So, we talked about that at the time of subdivision or planned unit development, buildings aren't being proposed yet, and so it's not a time when they can do a geotechnical analysis on a structure, but that could be something that could come out of the geotechnical report or certification at the time, where they may identify particular lots that should have a geotechnical analysis, or for instance on road building as well. So that was kind of wrapped into the geotechnical amendments that we proposed, and then this is just to eliminate the 20% prohibition on grading.
Come here for the neighborhood leadership meeting. Could you tell them to go to the Sol room? I thought this was the room.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
See you tonight.
Forgot to mention that this room theoretically was scheduled for that meeting at 7 p.m.
They swapped with me, so.
So,
Okay. We will make sure to let them know. Okay.
Anyone showing up?
Okay.
They should come and sit in. They would be very interested, I'm sure.
Commissioner Randall.
My only thought, I noticed the title on 8520 still says needed housing, so,
Oh,
and I know that's wordsmithing, but
where are we?
on page 17, the 8520, the needed housing part of the title didn't get updated.
Good catch, thank you.
That. Oh.
I think she's looking for neighborhood leaders.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Are we ready then to straw poll on 9.8325, section 5, and 9.8520, section 5, which are identical? All right. All those in favor?
Was that a,
Commissioner Borowski has a
Sideways.
sideways.
so five to neutral?
And a sideways. Oh, yeah.
Commissioner Borowski is.
Do you want to elaborate on your,
I brought up my concerns back at the geotechnical
Right.
analysis, and so that's why I'm sideways, because we're referring back to something that I weighed my concerns in on the geotech in the first place. So
Okay.
that's why I did that.
yes.
Okay, so I'm putting one neutral because of geotechnical concerns. Excuse me. Okay, great.
Yeah, no, if the
And that-
geotech, I'm fine with referring it to geotech as long as we can.
And your concerns, just to remind me and anyone else was specific to the adoption of
That
Dogami
was
maps
one of
that are not currently the standard,
Right.
but setting those standards would require official adoption of those.
Well, and then
A
getting,
version, we would adopt our own version based on that data layer.
Right.
But,
yeah, and then my concern was that if that's an adopted plan, finding a licensed engineer that could or would sign off on that, I don't know if that's.
Right. Can I ask a clarifying question about that? So currently, though, the standards would, that are, the resources that are used in providing that technical expertise are not standardized, they're just kind of, is that to what I could assume, that they're not necessarily standardized? So by adopting a standard map, that standardizes that process? Is that what we're trying to do there?
I think that it adds clarity by the intent in having a map and making it clear that we expect that the professional has considered it as part of their analysis. It's likely that that already occurs. It provides a little assurance that it occurs by making it by adopting the map and having that be part of the approval criteria, if that makes sense. I don't expect that this is one that would significantly change the practice of the people do, they're likely currently using Slido, we mentioned, or from, Dagami and other maps, and they may prefer to use, also consult the interactive maps that are available from Dagami. Those were problematic for us to look at adopting those actual maps, and so this is a way to at least address the fact that there is information related to slide risk available, and through concerns from neighbors and stakeholders that they would like to know that risks are fully being vetted and assessed.
Commissioner Baker.
And I have to agree with Commissioner Borowski, because I wasn't at that last meeting when this was discussed, but my concern is the state considers, I worked for the state for many years and worked with Dogami, not at that agency, but with another agency that worked closely with them in some cases. They consider 25% the maximum buildable slope. We, in our South Hill study, we consider 30%, but.
I actually did ask the representative and the people from Dagami, and they're even high-risk zones, they will not say that they are not buildable. So there is not a no-build area. It is just a matter of risk.
But they can characterize it as much higher risk, 25 or above, than, and in our case, we consider it 30%. So there's a discrepancy.
Well, and then the new the geotechnical amendments, we identified over 20% in part to recognize, and again, it's not no build, but it's identifying it as a potential risk factor.
Right, but we're sort of not aligned with the.
Are you referring to our buildable lands inventory where we use 30%
Right.
and it's Department of Land Conservation and Development that has 25 as a standard? And that's really about what they typically see as buildable. And we were able to use 30 because we see lands between 25 and 30 as buildable. We have seen them buildable. I don't believe that that is actually tied to Dogami or anything from Dogami.
Well, it was originally based on input from Dogami.
Okay, well, let's, since we did cover that before, let's move on to the next section. Is that where we are?
Okay. Okay, the next section is on page 15, or, yeah, starts on page 15.
Okay.
And this is regarding 1 acre accessible open space. And this is a criterion that only applies to planned unit developments. The existing requirement, and what was identified as a key issue, is that the existing requirement limits development to sites near existing open spaces such as public parks, which can reduce the amount of development that can occur under the clear and objective track. The other issue was that if they did proceed under clear and objective and weren't within a quarter mile of a public park, then the requirement to provide at least an acre of on-site open space can be prohibitive as well, and especially onerous for small development sites. So through the working groups and our recommendations, what we came up with was to revise the distance requirement from a quarter mile to a half mile. And you may recall that that was in part consistent with the Parks and Open Spaces goals of, not that these are a replacement for a public park, but they recognize that their goal is to have a public park within a quarter to a half mile of all developments. And so the recommendation was to revise that quarter mile distance to 1/2 mile, and also to include public schools as part of the qualifying public recreation areas. And then we had discussed a minimum open space area of 14,500 square feet, which is roughly 1/3 of an acre, and that came out of discussions from your discussions on the recommendation about kind of a minimum size that was, I can't remember the park name, that was a third of an acre.
Charnel Mulligan. Is it? No,
Fairmont Park?
Fairmount, starts with a W.
West University, smallest park in the city.
So that, we looked that up, and that was a third of an acre, and so that's where you'll see 14,500 being specified as the minimum square footage. So to address the scalable requirement, we also proposed that there'd be a 2-acre minimum development site size before the requirement for on-site provision kicks in. So it kind of breaks it out to unpack the code amendments before you a little bit. It breaks it out to, are you within a half a mile as opposed to a quarter of a mile? So we're expanding that radius. Also, I do want to note that there's been some recommended changes to the language on how it's measured, and we'll fine tune that. But a half a mile from a public park, public recreation facility, or a public school. If you're not within a half a mile, then the requirement for on-site provision of open space kicks in if the development site is 2 acres or larger. If you are proposing lot sizes that meet the, or lot areas that meet the minimum lot size or lot area within the base zone. So for instance, in R1, that's 4,500 square feet is the minimum lot area, then, or above, then you would need to provide 10% of your site as common open space area. If you were reducing the lot sizes through the plan unit development process, which sometimes happens, then depending on how much below the minimum lot area, you would provide either, well, originally we had it based on a formula that was provided. There's been some concern about the use of a formula, and formulas can be intimidating. And so another option that I'll show you in the draft code is to simplify that and basically have it be a couple different options depending on how much smaller the lot area is. Let me flip over to this. Okay, so here's the formula that, this isn't in your packet because this was kind of responding. This is one that we're still kind of testing ourselves how this one would work.
So can I ask a really quick clarifying question? You were referencing subsection 8, correct? But it says 7, so I just want to make sure we're all in the same place.
Correct.
So, okay, in case, because
That was a number
I noticed a few
change.
people
Right.
doing what I was doing. Okay.
it is
Sorry
8.
about that.
It is
It is-
8 or 7. I think it
It's
will
one
be
of the
7
ones that's
once we
kind of
take out 3
confusing
and
because
5.
it was formerly 9.
Right,
And it's being renumbered based on other changes, and so,
and I think it'll end up being
97
7.
in mine.
I think, yes, I think it will probably be 7, but,
One on the bottom of page 15,
right,
no, right,
okay.
7.
whatever it's not.
Whatever it will be, okay.
I think 7 is actually the correct one,
Yes.
because there's two,
That we move.
there's two criterion that would be removed, the 20% slope and the 30-foot buffer.
Right.
And so that
Takes us to
punches that
7.
down to 7, yes. So, so this and again, you'll have to look at the screen for this one. This one was not in the packet. The alternative one is in your packet. So the formula that would apply if the lot areas were smaller than the minimum lot area allowed in the base zone. That kind of comes up with a percentage of what open space you'd be required to do. An alternative that I think is, a good idea to move away from the formula would be to have a couple options, and again, we could fine tune what percentage of the site should be open space depending on how much the lots are reduced down. But this gives an example of like if the average lot area, so an average is a mathematical formula. You would add up the lot area of, if you've got 20 lots, you add up all of those lots, divide by 20, that's your average lot area. Then in, like the example I was giving, if it's R1, then the minimum lot area is 4,500. So you do a division, find out what percentage it is. If it's within 10% of the minimum lot area, then you would provide 15%. So the idea is if the lots are getting smaller, that you're requiring a little bit more open space on site, if the open space is even required, if you were not within a half a mile of a public park, public school, or public recreation facility.
Commissioner Borowski?
So refresh my memory, because it seemed to me that we talked about taking out the open space requirement entirely with the caveat that if it's a PUD that's all single family, then putting a large chunk of open space is taking away buildable lands. And two, if it was a PUD that had multifamily in it, the multifamily open space standards would kick in. Is this that same section?
Kind of. So there were two open space issues that we looked at. There's the 40% open space that applies in the South Hills.
Okay.
And then there's the 1 acre on-site open space. So they're similar to some extent, and the way the recommendations went, the 40%, which we'll get to in a minute, was the one that was proposed to be completely removed. And you're correct, we did point out other things like lot coverage requirements and multifamily open space. This one ties into that a little bit in that at the kind of worst case scenario, if you are really reducing the lot sizes quite a bit, more than 10% below the minimum lot area, and over 2 acres and not within half a mile, the most open space you would provide on site would be 20% of the development site, and that's consistent with the multifamily 20%.
That clears things up.
Commissioner Baker, then Commissioner Randall.
Yeah, this is one I've had issues with in the past. I'm not in favor of changing the dimensions to from a quarter to a half. This is what we use in the multifamily adjustments for open space in the R3 and R4 near the university. Not only that, other jurisdictions, including New York City, meet this guideline, 3.5 blocks. And parks used to propose this guideline. My point of view, having dealt with parks for over 25 years, now they realize because they don't have any plan to purchase pocket parks to meet this requirement in most parts of the city, they've, instead of proposing, from my point of view, we've purchased a lot of parks and we have some big, larger parks, but we aren't considering, purchasing pocket parks, smaller parks like West University, to make parks more accessible to the population as the density grows. Whereas New York City has parks every 3.5 blocks. And yet my other complaint about this is, which I've mentioned before, is somehow you have to word it so that at any point along the property line that does not intersect a railroad or limited access roadway. In other words, it doesn't matter if a park is located on the other side of a railroad, you can't get to it. Or if it's on the other side of a freeway, you can't get to it. So that should be in the code. Otherwise, we're allowing some exception, but the park isn't going to be accessible to the people that live in this PUD or, those are my objections.
Okay, and if I could respond just a little bit, this would be private, held in common to the development and only accessible to only legally accessible to the residents of the development. It's not a way to acquire public parks.
No.
And in talking to parks staff, it doesn't mean that they aren't continually looking to serve these areas. Like they wouldn't look at the fact that there's private common open space on a development and not locate a park there if they can acquire one, if that makes sense.
That's not my issue. The issue is that we're giving a waiver to this requirement if they're within a certain distance to a park, and that distance should be a quarter of a mile. It's not that,
Yeah, I understand your objection. I just
it's the
also
same
want to
thing
point
we
out,
have
though,
in
that the
multifamily.
recommendation did go through to
there were
revise
some
it.
people that were opposed. I mean, I was opposed to that, you know, and
Acknowledged, but it did pass, and it did pass again at city
I'm just
council, so.
saying my
Okay.
objections.
All right, let's keep moving.
on.
We've got less than 15 minutes, and we got a few more things to get through, so let's just,
I was glad to see you take the formula out, and I would
You would
vote for
support that?
alternative 2, because otherwise I have several questions on the formula. So if we're heading toward alternative 2, I will save those questions or ignore them. So I think it's a better way to look at it.
approach it.
It's a lot clearer.
And it could still be massaged and
Yeah.
refined too,
I think the
in
concept, I
itself,
think,
but the idea.
is a lot better than the formula.
Okay.
Are you looking for that kind of feedback at this point?
I would like that
You wanna
because this
know-
is kind of a recent
Okay.
change, but it is one that I think, would be good to know, to get a gauge on.
Okay. Does anybody else have any comments about their preference for the formula versus a more prescriptive, kind of laid out thoughts?
Well, again, I think this is a good opportunity to illustrate that there's more work to be done.
Okay,
So we recognize that the previous formula, which I didn't understand, has now been replaced by something which I've only seen for 15 minutes.
Correct. Right.
But I'm sure with time that's built into the process, we can fine tune that. So I like the change.
okay.
I think the general framework that I'm looking for your input on is that idea that having the first change be the quarter mile to half mile, and that kind of test, let's say, then based on that test, whether you need to provide on-site common open space, and then the scalability factor, that whether you feel that this framework generally gets at those goals.
Right. Yeah, I would say that I think the alternative 2 addresses the scalability a little bit better. I don't know what that,
The formula
translates
also
to,
doesn't
but-
provide a cap, and that was one of the problems that I was getting into as I was trying, we're continuing to try to test these as well and,
Okay.
and identify concerns. And this kind of caps out at the 20% rather than having a formula that you could theoretically have a very large percentage come out of.
okay. How do you guys want to weigh in on this one? Do you want to weigh in with preference for alternative 1 or alternative 2? Do you have thoughts on that? Do you have,
Why don't we start with that and then look at the overall?
and we'll look it over, okay? So let's do that. Let's, all those who have a preference for alternative 1 over alternative 2? All right, how about all those who have a preference for alternative 2?
Just the verbiage. Is that what it was?
The narrative, yeah.
Just the, yes, just the narrative, just basically
Concept.
the concept, not talking about, overall.
Hard and fast.
Yeah, okay. So it looks like alternative 2 is definitely a preference.
Was that unanimous?
I think that was 6-0 for that alternative. So then let's go back and look at then where everybody's at with regards to the actual section. So let's look at 9.8325 subsection 7, as it's labeled in here.
sorry.
And let's get a straw poll on that
With
with the alternative two caveat. So I'm going to be a yes on that. Okay.
And my concerns are, it should.
The specific
give
to
an
the-
exemption if you have to cross a freeway or a railroad. And also, I think the dimension should be 1/4 mile. But definitely shouldn't get an adjustment if you can't get there.
Okay. Okay.
Can I follow up with you potentially on, because I think we might be able to even look at a map and the areas that would be within the half a mile, even I think the 1/4 mile. I don't know that the conditions that you're describing would have even really applied. So it may, would that make you feel more comfortable if you, to kind of explore that a little more?
PUD, you could apply for a PUD in pretty much anywhere in the city.
True, voluntary, okay.
Right. So, and we do have freeways throughout the city, and we also have some railroads, on the south side of town that go through existing neighborhoods.
Okay, so I'll leave your,
It's, if it was some zone specific and we could look at a map, but this is a PUD, you could take 3 R1 lots and do a PUD.
okay.
Can I ask you a clarifying question?
You
Didn't the
don't?
city, no?
Okay.
No, okay.
Oh, no, you can ask a clarifying.
Oh, yes, of
Sorry.
course, of course. I
Sorry.
apologize. We're,
Having a side conversation.
clarification.
no. Commissioner Fragla.
Shut her down.
Such a rule follower sometimes. Did you say, I'm just clarifying, city council voted on this already? This was
The
part of
recommendation.
the recommendation, right?
The recommendation, and the recommendation included specifically the change from a 1/4 mile to a half mile, and then the concept of scalable and being more inclusive of like public schools. Okay, so do we want to do a time check?
Yeah.
I don't know that we're going to get
About
through
One, you can't, right.
in 8
Right.
minutes.
We need to
Yeah,
stop it.
so we've got 8 minutes and a little
A
bit,
couple of them in 8 minutes. I'm just not sure if any of the ones we have left are ones that we're going to get in 8 minutes.
yeah,
Right.
What do we have left?
right, that's what I'm trying to.
Trees.
Well, trees
we're
are
gonna-
definitely next week.
Yep.
For tonight, we have subsection 12 of the PUD requirements, and,
Labeled in your packet as subsection 10.
changed now, formerly known
Bottom
as.
Page 16,
Bottom of page 6.
yeah, basically
it?
you have page 16 and 17 left.
So, but this one is one that has some multiple criteria that relate to the South Hill study and that relate to changes that are proposed, so.
So let's maybe do this. We're back here on the 30th,
Next Tuesday.
Tuesday, 5:30 here. Maybe we can pick up that and then go through the tree removal standards. And you think we'll have time to wrap up everything in that? Okay. So
The only 2 left.
I think so.
I think those are the only two
It's just, yeah.
Only 2 left, I think.
before we go back to the tree.
Well, there's 3 things, there's, within this next set, there's 3 things. There's some changes that pertain to limitations over 900 feet in elevation. There's changes, a easy change, I think, for the ridgeline setback. It's not a significant amendment. And then there's changes to the 40% open space requirement, which again, that one's fairly straightforward because it's removal of the recommendation was to remove the criterion. So the biggest thing I think is more these the limitation over 900 feet. There's a couple different sections and they relate to each other. So
So let's
I think we're
just
okay.
move that to next week, I think. Makes sense. Were there any other items from staff? Robin, did you have anything?
Well, I think I've tried to keep you all in the loop regarding the appointments that are coming up for Planning Commission. Because there's council's interviewing some folks tomorrow at noon. So that's that. You know, I just don't have anything to add there.
Are those open to the public but just not webcast or?
Yeah, that's correct. So I don't fully understand all the details behind it, but I think the point was to not webcast it so that you didn't have one candidate listening to the webcast of another
Right.
candidate and then rebutting or I don't know what. So I think that's what's going to happen. I don't know if they've worked it out because there is another item that is not interviews tomorrow. So, but that's my understanding. So we just wanted to give you a quick update on some hiring. We have a couple of candidates that we've got on the hook for both the senior planner for the land use team. Since Janessa's now working with our partner land use team in BPS. And Zach Galloway's replacement we've been looking for quite some time. So we've been doing a couple of recruitment processes to find someone that we think is going to be a really good fit for that. Hopefully that candidate will also be starting pretty soon. I think both of them, if all goes well, will be starting in May. One in early May, one perhaps a little bit later in May. We're also doing a little bit of recruitment to just beef up some support in the land use team, which is helpful. And then a little additional support for urban reserves because that's going to be ramping up here very soon. And then some of you may know already, Eric Brown has taken a position as the downtown manager. He was the one, of course, managing the River Road Santa Clara project in Zach's absence. So, yeah, so we're going to be recruiting to backfill that position as well. So there's a lot of hiring going on. There's which means new folks, which means training, which means not necessarily operating at our peak efficiency until we get folks trained up. But hopefully everybody will be able to show up and introduce themselves to you guys and you'll get to know them along with us. So
Okay.
I don't think I have anything else to add in terms of budget or other questions or issues.
All right. Thank you all. Oh, Commissioner Baker? Yeah.
Oh, don't you want from commissioners?
Yes, but we've got 2 minutes.
Okay. The Historic Review Board met in March, the end of March, and May is Historic Preservation Month. So actually, the board said, I set up, but that's okay. There are going to be 2 talks we've scheduled in May. One's on May 19th at 2 p.m., which is a historic photo and video tour of Agripac, the last cannery in Eugene. Before it was demolished, the city got a grant and photo and video documented the cannery, including the working stations and some of the workers. And it's an interesting story because Chiquita Bananas owned it then and tried to sabotage this process. The city was, but community members and and Agripac employees circumvented their efforts. Then there'll be another talk on Thursday, May 30th at 6 p.m. On the original Southern Pacific State, well, what we now call Amtrak Station, which is built by Southern Pacific. It's only one of 6 masonry railroad stations that were built between San Diego and Portland. So it's going to be a talk about that because that was also, the city got a grant to document that. And it's also interesting in both cases, the local photographic society, Emerald Photographics, won the bid and documented it for the community. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. There's some other things that are going on, but those are the main things.
Why don't we do this? If anybody else has any updates, why don't we, unless they're really pressing, let's go ahead and move those to next week as well. Does that sound good? All right. With that, we are adjourned.